Good afternoon, City of Rochester. Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Equity Alliance Equity Series. We are really excited to still be going, and I'm hoping that everyone is settled in for this weather that might be coming our way. As a reminder, though, the Equity Alliance was formed probably about 2 years ago, currently a partnership between the City of Rochester and Destination Medical Center. My name is Chow Motella. I serve the City of Rochester as a Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Accessibility Director. And today I'm joined by a counterpart from DMC who is filling in, Lauren Jensen. So Lauren, thank you for taking on the role of assisting today. As a reminder, the Equity Alliance has been in existence, but our commitment really is to co-creating a healthier Rochester. So really happy that you continue to be a part of this. If this is your first time, welcome. But if you are joining us for the 10th, 20th, or 18th session, I'm excited that you continue to come back and be here. Many of you have heard about or participated in community co-design. And so really excited to have Jess Roberts join us today to talk about community co-design from a very maybe different perspective than we have typically had this conversation on. We usually have talked about co-design from the perspective of an engagement tool, but not so much about how we can utilize it as civic infrastructure. How do we get people who often are not connected to decision-making to a decision-making role? Jess is no foreigner in this space. He was a participant in co-creating that first co-design toolkit, and also would like to share that he is the founder and lead of the co-design facilitator by Design LLC. He partners with health systems, public agencies, educational institutions, and governing bodies to redesign how decisions are made. And very importantly, by whom, right? He's trained as an architect. He approaches persistent gaps in health, education, and civic participation as design failures, right? So we are just kind of excited to hear how he will get this conversation. I would encourage you to utilize the chat for any reflections or any questions that you might have, and we'll make sure to address those as we get closer to the end of that conversation. So without further ado, Jess, would like to welcome you to this conversation and a reframe of how we discuss and talk about co-design.
Thanks, Chow, as always. So thanks everyone. Again, as Chow mentioned, it's a little bit different approach today to sort of orientation. I know a lot of familiar faces in the room that have participated in co-design training, previous presentations that were a bit more focused on the practice of co-design. We'll touch a little bit on that in its relationship here, but today I really wanted to sort of look at the process, and more specifically, the process as it applies to, that civic infrastructure, the infrastructure needed to drive civil rights, truly sort of democratic participation. And so speaking to that reality, and then, look to sort of spur some conversation around what role we as individuals, part of larger organizations, might actually play in that work. So, again, my intention today isn't to, outline co-design as a project methodology with an equity focus, even though that's obviously an important part of this, but really hone in on the process of co-design and how it can build that civic infrastructure, which is sort of the conditions for democratic participation and the civil rights. So really in this way, the process, and we've talked in the past about the value proposition of the co-design, not necessarily being the project outcome, although that is a part of it. We really want to talk about it at the process as a whole and the value proposition of that process towards the civic infrastructure conversation. So, first of all, I want to sort of set the groundwork that, like, what is this work specifically? Number one, I want to note, like, this isn't new. This isn't a new concept, right? Collective decision making, lived experience of the people has always been part of how healthy societies have functioned. Um, on the other side of the coin, right, the less healthy or unhealthy societies, you've seen what happens, which is concentration of power and wealth, um, making decisions on behalf of the communities that aren't served well. And we can probably point to things happening here politically, right? A lot of the political angst on both sides of the aisle probably points to this very issue, right? Number two, this is a civil rights problem. It's not just the outcomes and the policies that we need to really sort of focus on. It's, how are they constructed? Who's part of that? Who has standing in that process? Whose knowledge, wisdom, experience matters or counts in that conversation, and who has authority in driving those outcomes at the point of decision making. And then third is that, this is not something abstract that systems are not just in place as they are from the point of, the birth of the solar system. These systems have been designed, right? And because they've been designed, they very much reflect the assumptions, experiences, biases of the very people who built them, right? Unfortunately, when the people most affected are absent from that process, um, and avoid understanding those, really bringing in that lived experience and both sort of what folks are struggling with as well as what they have access to or how they're solving these issues, we tend to get the same sort of outcome over and over again. So this is, some of you may be familiar with this. This is the water of systems change, and it's a systems approach diagram, basically. And what I really want to point out is that, civil rights don't exist at that top level, right? The policies, the practices, what those resources are, how they're distributed, all matter, but how those things show up and why they show up is the sort of layer deeper, which is what are the quality and number of those connections within the community? What is the access to the power and influence of making decisions to inform these things? What are the assumptions that go into making those decisions? And then ultimately, underpinning that is what are the mental models that are driving who gets to participate, where that power lives, etc. And so, the bottom of this diagram that I've sort of outlined here, that is civic infrastructure, right? That's where it lives, that's what it is. And that's where that democratic participation either exists or it doesn't, right? Democratic participation at its very least is going in to vote every 4 years, right? What we're talking about is the underpinning structures that drive the things that affect our lives on a daily basis. Um, Luckily, this is also where co-design lives, right? It operates, um, in shifting, opening opportunities for those relationships and connections to grow, finding different ways for those relationships to exist, right? It isn't just one-sided, any healthy relationship. It shifts that power dynamic, who gets to participate in the process and in what ways. And maybe more importantly, what I found in doing that work, it isn't about just changing minds to hope that we get to better relationships and shared power structures. It's actually by building those relationships, you start to shift and change minds and hearts by the doing and the engaging and building of relationships. So in many ways, the co-design process sort of reframes this and starts at that level of the relationship and starts to shift those mental models, which again helps feed into more opportunities for those relationships and connections and access to decision making. And I think that is a hopeful illustration of how we can really start to shift what participation looks like, what civic engagement looks like. So the civic infrastructure, this is for folks that are interested in digging into this more, this is a Robert Wood Johnson funded article that was published in 2020, and it's called Leading Locally, a Community Power Building Approach to Structural Change. And they outline a couple key things, and they recognize that civic infrastructure is not a program, right? It's not a specific thing, an outcome. It is the underlying capacity and structures that successful programs and policies depend on. And so they break it down into sort of four key ingredients. The first one is an organized base. So basically, the communities most impacted can join forces, can activate and be engaged through these structures without additional barriers or things that get in the way, right? They participate in agenda setting authority. So, who gets to determine what matters? What are the problems that need to be solved in the first place, right? Then there's the decision-making influence. So who gets to determine what our response to those challenges are? And then obviously the sort of the in those outcomes that mutual accountability with decision makers. So holding the system accountable over time to the lived experience, not just to some predetermined metrics that were organized and set before you've done any of these things, right? So building relationship and connection that I have found is a really effective way to build accountability, much more so than a static set of metrics. So, civic structure, how it sort of overlays with co-design, is that, this is civil rights, democratic participation. They're not an abstraction in this work, right? It's not like equity, right? We throw these words out and we say we need to be more equitable. We need to have more opportunity for that civic participation, but it's more of a mission statement and we struggle to sort of put it into action. So in co-design, there's sort of three structural questions that drive everything. And each of these questions lives at that relational power dynamic level, right? So co-design, again, lives squarely in the middle of that systems diagram. And it asks, who has the standing to define the problems themselves, right? We think about a lot of the processes we might use. We've already have a pretty strictly defined problem space, and at worst, already have a pretty strictly defined solution to that problem space before we even do any of this, right? So then who has the authority to design the solutions? And whose criteria are we being held accountable to, right? Like whose value of or whose definition of value are we really assessing this around? And you'll note I'll cite there will be several citations in this presentation that we'll share with everyone. One of them is a paper that I pulled together recently, sort of around this notion of shifting to from sort of interpretation of community voice and more community voice and experience as governance. And so, what you see here in the quote is from that paper is that, without the structural opportunity to influence and share power, we just sort of sugarcoat it, right? We say we're being more equitable here. We're hearing from community, but if community doesn't have an active role in that process, we are just sort of going through the motions. And so, given those sort of three questions, I want to take a quick pause. You can sort of throw it in the chat, yell it out, whatever fits. I'm wondering, which um, which one is hardest or most difficult to answer in your current work, and maybe why?
Did you say that we could just come off mute?
Yep.
I don't know. The one about the solutions being accountable is tricky because often they're accountable to multiple people, and
Hmm.
often that accountability can clash sometimes. Do you know what I'm saying?
Hmm.
And so I think that's the most difficult thing for me to respond to in that one.
And why do you think the accountabilities can clash?
Because sometimes you have conflicting needs, right?
Hmm.
So my role is that I'm an ADA coordinator. And so I
Hmm.
obviously am beholden to people who are living with disability and to access overall. But those things are expensive to do well. Equity as a whole is very expensive to do well, right? And we are also beholden to the public to steward their funds in a responsible and logical way, in an honorable way, you know? And so you can't always do all of the things that you're responsible for with integrity in a way that's easy or straightforward or that doesn't cause tensions between departments or colleagues. It can be really, really tough, even though everyone has excellent intentions. You know, I work with phenomenal colleagues, but sometimes that accountability isn't so straightforward. And the underlying accountability to the public even isn't so straightforward. At the end of the
Hmm.
day, we're a city and we have to remain. Do you know what I'm saying? I think I've probably
Hmm.
explained myself, but yeah, that's what we can be up against sometimes.
Yeah, and I see someone else chatted, Linda chatted similarly. Um, and so we'll touch a little bit here shortly about sort of the scoping and what are the guardrails to this type of approach, because one of the other traps we can fall in this work is that we can sort of go in with this idea of no guardrails or boundaries, or we engage in a way that suggests tell us what you want or need rather than what is the precise opportunity given these constraints, that power can be shared within those sort of constraints, because I've worked on projects where and this can be a real challenge in engagement in general, is getting the energy, excitement of community. They're sharing a lot of things, and the intention never was like, oh, we can do anything, so just share all of these great ideas you have, nor are many of these ideas viable. Instead, in this process, we really talk about and we'll talk here shortly about what does that accountability look like over time is more about the intention behind these experiences, not necessarily the specific thing that comes to mind from our community. So we'll talk about the pillars and the design criteria that comes out of a process like that that informs those outcomes rather than the specific outcomes. Al, what do you mean by who are the co-designers accounted? I'm assuming you mean accountable to.
Yeah, hello. The I'm sorry, I got a video on. Now, the the concept, of course, is that when you during the co-designing process, you selected co-designers.
Hmm.
Co-designers, you know, by definition, should represent certain points of view from their constituents are represented by the co-designer. So the first order really is the co-designer is themselves accountable to the particular audience
Hmm.
that is really required to design a particular problem. There's a solution to that particular problem. So that is the first orders
Hmm.
of accountability, it seems to me. And then, of course, ultimately, if other people themselves are impacted by the particular problem solution or the project itself, right? So it's to me is really the most identifiable participants of this whole process really is are the co-designers themselves. Uh,
Hmm.
all accountability to them, obviously, but
Hmm.
then from them they need to be answerable to the people that really they represent or they gather their information from.
Yeah, that's a great insight, Al. So there's sort of a couple dynamics here. One is that accountability. So co-designers don't come in as just bringing their own perspective or experience. They're that conduit sort of accountable conduit to the communities that they're part of. So they're not just designing on their own experience or own perspective. They are accountable to the communities that they're engaging in that process, but also accountable because they're sort of hired as, consultants, formalizing again that sort of powered decision-making structure as you would hire a consultant, right? So you're accountable to the project, you're accountable to those budget constraints, you're accountable to timelines, you're accountable to the product outcome that's going to be most useful to your partnering organizations. So it's sort of both sides. And I think that tension between those things is where the great work occurs, right? So again, I mentioned you need the guardrails, and the guardrails, are sort of set through that sort of triangulation or tension, productive tension between lived experience and sort of organizational expertise.
And just, I'm the person in the chat that said, in jest, can we say all three,
Yeah.
right? But I would maybe say that I believe the first one is
Hmm.
particularly difficult for organizations, public serving organizations, in terms of who defines the problem. Because quite often for organizations, we're solving problems as they impact us, not necessarily problems as they impact the communities that we're serving. And so it is a hard reframe for organizations to say, are we solving the problem we want to solve for ourselves? Or are we solving the problem as the communities who are impacted would define it?
Hmm. Yeah, and this is, something I hear a lot too is, well, the grant, we need to, be clear on what this problem and sometimes even what the solution might be in the grant that we received, right? And my question would be, number one, that there are other structures other than some of these more rigid grants, but even within that grant, who gets to participate in the development of that proposal then, right? Like why don't we involve some of the same folks you're talking about collaborating as part of that grant on that front end so they can actually be part of designing what is the problem we're aiming to solve? All right. We'll have some time for some more Q&A, but just wanted to sort of call some of those things out because those are all, I mean, there is no clear answer to any of those, right? It's going to look different community to community, organization to organization, but it is important to be asking those questions when there's an opportunity to actually do something with them. And so co-design again is not it is project based, but it's not necessarily a project. It's the way in which you organize the base, right? It's that agenda setting authority, decision making influence, mutual accountability. It's built into that process and structure. It brings it, and it's not just, again, we do those things, but it is how are you bringing the communities into those spaces to do that in an authentic way, right? That is the civic infrastructure muscle that I think has been sort of co-opted. It's been fragmented. So we we have again, this isn't new, right? Our societies have sort of operated in this way, but because of how we operate now, um, it makes it more difficult. This is a muscle we haven't used in a long time, but it really is about how we do this in a strategic, meaningful way. Again, within the guardrails of, within the guardrails of the realities that, many of your organizations are operating within. Um, so many of you are also familiar with the spectrum of community participation and engagement, the IAPP. Um, you know, on one end you have sort of the consult, on the other end you have that sort of empowerment. So co-design really is about that governance. What does governance look like? And you'll see this quote at the bottom here from that health affairs article I mentioned. Um, community members are participating and contributing to um, and have the power to do those things. Otherwise, again, you're just sort of going through the motions in some of these other spaces. So what does governance look like? What is the ability to offer that space for governance? Because again, to the earlier point, this isn't a pendulum, right? It isn't either we extract information and interpret it within the or institutions that oftentimes can be pretty distant from the lived experiences they're aiming to sort of serve, or we swing the pendulum the other way and it's like, let's just ask the community and do what the community tells us, right? Neither of those is going to be all that productive. There's something in the middle there that allows us to both bring and start to shift and nudge those power disparities and respond to the reality of the situations we're all, facing. So that's really what co-design is about. And that's the co piece, right? It is recognizing that with those guardrails, from my background in design, the best design comes from where you have that productive tension, right? Where you're able to engage and do something productive because, it isn't a dictating a direction, but it's also not all possibilities, right? It's a sort of sweet spot in being able to bring folks in and engage in meaningful ways. So in co-design, there's 8 foundational principles to practice, but I want to highlight 4 of them that I think are especially pertinent to the civic engagement conversation. Um, the first one is lived experiences expertise, obviously, right? Because the people who are navigating our inadequate systems hold an awful lot of knowledge and experience that no other external consultant or resource is going to be able to bring forward in the same way, and certainly not with the same urgency, right? So this is that top level, those policies, programs, resource flows. How are they actually showing up in people's lives? How are they actually affecting people, specifically the people we know we're not hearing from regularly? What do those impacts look like, even if they were never intended, right? Which often is the case. They are still showing up in a certain way and can still be doing harm that wasn't, even if it wasn't intended, it's still doing harm, right? The second one is targeting that system behavior. So shifting from, you know, this notion of community not showing up as a community problem, right? Exclusion is community just doesn't care sort of perspective to what's happening within the systems that isn't allowing for communities to show up and our full community to be able to show up in meaningful ways, right? Again, this is a system design issue, not a community deficit, right? A trauma-informed structure to the process. So communities that are already disproportionately burdened by these structural inequalities have been disproportionately exposed to broken promises, extractive approaches, research and engagement that doesn't produce anything tangible or of little value to the community themselves, while they see the people who are leveraging their lived experience benefiting from that, whether it's through recognition, compensation, all these other things, right? So not only are you not moving the needle for these communities, you are leveraging them and benefiting on the backs of these communities. And then finally, trust is a power problem. So trust is only built when communities experience that real autonomy, real influence. It's in design we call it show, don't tell, right? We do a lot of talk, we create a lot of promises for community, and rarely are able to fill those. So instead, let's just do and demonstrate. If the community can feel them, they're going to invest differently in those relationships with you and your organization. So one sort of quick example of what this might look like is a project we're doing in Rochester. And it was around LGBTQ plus healthcare access, right? So the project isn't just that we came up with 3 sort of community defined outcomes or solutions, but how those solutions were developed, how they were assessed, how they were held accountable. Um, so one of the outcomes was a peer referral or a peer assessed resource model where peers would identify resources that actually worked in the community, whether they're formal or informal. One of our co-designers did an internship with the County Public Health Department to actually build that, and it's up and running. The other thing that came out of this was a sort of narrative-based training for providers around LGBTQ care. And what came out of that was number one, the community co-designers didn't want just a sort of do's and don'ts of care. It was a narrative base. So here's how this can show up in real life, and let's have a conversation about how it might look different. And so they themselves developed there's a three modules for this training built on lived experience that existed in the community. They not only were compensated to build that and refine that, they are now being compensated to deliver this, right? They are now delivering versions of this. They delivered it to the County Public Health Department and have delivered a couple different versions of this within Mayo itself, right? And they themselves are the one that continue to sort of refine and tweak and deliver this and be compensated and recognized for this. Part of that recognition is next month we're going to a national conference where our co-designers will be presenting on this, right? So it's what is that power shifting? What does that relationship look like? The project has long since been over, but the impacts of that project continue to live on through the very lived experiences we say matter most. So this is a quote from one of the co-designers when I asked them what co-design is. And it recognizes that you know we sort of misattribute exclusion again for communities like Chow has often cited, like who are we not hearing from in our surveys, right? The question isn't how do we get the folks we're not hearing from to respond to these surveys. It's understanding why are they not responding to these surveys because there's a lot of reasons why, and a lot of reasons are not being reached. And so it's not an education issue. It's not a convincing issue. It's not a branding or marketing issue, right? And that's what this quote is about. What is it, what do our practices look like if we are to be persuaded rather than persuasive, right? Being persuasive is I need to understand you better so I can better understand how to get you to do what the system does or what the system knowledge tells us. Being persuaded is, again, really understanding how these things are showing up in people's daily lives and for the system to respond to that, right? And the only way I can do that effectively is by having those experiences and perspectives and the conduits to the community in the development of what are the problems or how we reframe how we're thinking about the problem. How are we approaching and thinking about and developing and making decisions on the solution? How are we developing those and how are we assessing them and by whose sort of criteria? So this is the co-design sequence. I'm sure, again, many of you are familiar with. There's sort of four main phases or components. It's not linear. It is sequential, but it's not linear. It is iterative. Project identification and scoping is recognition that we need to build on what is already known about these things, both from literature and research, as well as community conversations and input. We need to be really proactive about recruiting through relational networks the people we know we're not hearing from, right? Because usually the decisions are being made by the people who quite possibly are the furthest removed from the very lived experiences that they're aiming to, address. The equitable co-design will dive in a little bit deeper. That's sort of the actual process of the co-design work. And then that development, implementation, and governance are ongoing. How do we develop? How did the voice continue to guide and inform and hold accountable? Um, Again, this is sequential. I did a presentation for a nonprofit philanthropic board years ago, and they asked, well, how do you know you've identified the right project? Like those, what are those guardrails? How do you know you've recruited the quote unquote right communities members? And it occurred to me at that moment that we don't know those things, and we certainly shouldn't think we know those things going in. Or again, we've defaulted to the very same trap we illustrated earlier, which is we've already identified a problem, we've already guided probably towards some solution, and now we're just looking for that validation from through our community engagement rather than more of an equitable guidance. And so each phase of this is really a decision point about that power, right? A moment where that civic infrastructure can be built and built on or eroded. So the scoping creates the conditions, and this is again the overlay with that lead local framework for the organized base, right? Because we're treating the problem as something that's fluid. It isn't already set. It isn't, we identified a problem, so now we need to seek the community that aligns with that definition. No, we need to seek the community dealing with these things that help us reframe that. Proactive recruitment builds the organized base itself, right? By reaching those that are typically structurally excluded from that engagement, from that voice being shared. Equitable co-design builds the agenda setting authority and decision-making structure. Like that is a part of that. It's sort of, I often say, following the lead of the lived experience as much as possible. Implementation and governance, that is the decision-making influence, and then the mutual accountability, right? By extending that authority through implementation beyond, again, the sort of bounds of a traditional project timeline. Um, and together, this again is that civic infrastructure. Doing these activities is how you're building that civic infrastructure. And again, it's almost project agnostic. The project matters actually less. It is a part of, but it matters less than the sort of cumulative effects of doing all of these things. So the equitable co-design is that sort of iterative process that, is central to what we do, right? The co-design work. So this is sort of an illustration of what that process tends to look like. A couple things you'll note, right away is number one, it's not a one-off, right? When we talk about building trust and relationship, it takes some time. This can't be 100 one-off conversations with different community members. It is about going deep. It is about building opportunity for the community member conduit to go out and have these conversations within their trusted networks and bring that information forward. This allows us to build broadly at first, but become increasingly precise on what policies, program, resource allocations affect us most, might best align to this particular condition and situation. So this really is about how that civic infrastructure gets built by the iterative structure itself. Additionally, this model of coming together, going out, engaging community, coming back together really continues to build those connections, build out that you know that organized base of community members, activating the community, a broader set of communities, building more robust relationships within those communities. Again, strategically, these communities where those things don't already exist, right? Because we'll get questions oftentimes of like, why didn't you engage my community? Well, number one, that, you know, we identify communities based on where the greatest disparity lives. And number two, if you're able to ask people with some power and influence why they're not participating, you've sort of answered the question in the first place because you've already have that access, that channel to influence that the communities we're working with usually do not. And then finally, the sort of implementation. And so this sort of navigates us away from here's a handoff or a report or something. And certainly those things can be part of the project or the outcomes, but it's what are those roles? What are those relationships that build and bridge beyond just some final product? And so usually what we do, like I mentioned before, this isn't about asking community what they want because people know how things feel, how they experience these policies, programs, etc. They probably don't know what the policies, programs, resource allocations could look like that better align to their lived realities. So this process is really about what are the criteria for successful solutions that we work with those within the institutions with that learned expertise. How are the pillars, the criteria and the individuals part of that governing model, right? So not only setting here's the criteria we're going to assess and evaluate this work by, but who gets to be part of that evaluation process themselves, right? And then recognizing that the most accountable thing you can build is that relationship, right? I have not found an organization hold accountability to a set of static, cold, metrics outlined on a piece of paper like they do with a living, breathing relationship, right? You can't help but to build accountability through that process itself. And so the evaluation structure that I want to share too, this is adapted from the National Academy of Medicine, helps us, again, helps sort of re-illustrate that the outcomes is just a part of this, right? A full picture of that civic infrastructure. To do this well, we need to be paying attention to that expanded knowledge. What are the new insights, new ways of thinking of things, culturally specific ways, more bi-directional, that it is expertise, but it is also certainly lived experience that influences and evolves this knowledge base. How are you building those strength and strengthening those partnerships and alliances, right? That it is about shared power, building that trust, investing differently financially and otherwise in the people that bring that lived experience, and how are they sustained over time? Obviously, improve programs, outcomes of the work is also a part of this, right? But it isn't the part. And ultimately, if you do those three things well, you have the thriving communities because you improve health, wealth, power. And that is the outcome. That is the civic infrastructure. If you're not assessing for those things, it is a project outcome, which is fine, but ultimately done well, co-design and any sort of civic infrastructure building should respond to these three core components. And so, just to sort of, again, reiterate that relationship is central to this. We build on existing relationships to do the work. We grow those relationships over time to execute on the work. And then we sustain those relationships far beyond the project that we're working on together. And so, again, the metrics are abstract. The relationship is the thing that sustains. It's the thing that holds accountable. And it is what co-design and democratic participation looks like when you embed it in the process itself and not hope that it's just some outcome of it. We'll get to you in 1 second. Last slide here. So here's the key questions to be asking, co-design questions to be asking as you're going into some of this work. And again, we can do another presentation on like what is a good co-design project versus not, right? This isn't to suggest that it is only co-design, but are the people most affected by this problem absent from how it's being defined, how it's being developed? Do you know who the folks that are most affected are? And if you do, why are they not? Why are you not hearing from them, right? is leadership actually prepared to shift some of this? That doesn't mean, oh, I give up all my power. No, this is shifting and sharing of power and decision making where it makes the most sense, right? Is the institution prepared for those relationships and the accountability that comes along with those relationships, right? You can't pass it off like a report. Um, are people being recognized and compensated to reflect the value proposition here, to reflect that they are bringing something of equal value to other expertise, right? And if not, why, right? We have a lot of constraints to that, I know. And then will community authority be able to be bridged beyond the end date to any particular project? And if so, what ways? So, a couple questions here. You can ask questions about the framework, the structure, anything I shared as well. But I know Al got in early, so Al, what do you got?
I recall the fact that we started this co-designing concept as a follow-up or as a action that sort of gets birthed by the concept of wanted to get together to look into our goal to become America's City of Health.
Hmm.
Right? So I guess I'm just kind of reflecting again, if we were to really co-design something to affect that being America's City of Health, that would be a pretty good, project to start with. And applying what you talked about, the different elements to that particular project, America's City of Health. So I'm just kind of raising an
No, yeah,
idea.
and who even
Yeah,
the process, right?
right, exactly.
Again,
Yeah.
if we see the City for Health as this sort of static end product, that's probably not the right thing, right? It is how we are living, engaging, adapting, right?
Right.
So part of it is laying that the infrastructure that allows for that to happen, because that is likely what health looks and feels like.
So given that, what would be the governance? Seems like you need to have governance structure to
Hmm.
oversee that
Hmm.
that longer term, evolution, building relationships.
Hmm.
Is that how you would think about that? If you were to really recommend some kind of steps toward that
No,
implementation.
yeah, I think when we think about the city and DMC, I know this is something we've been thinking about. What is the pairing that makes sense for that community instruction guidance without being too extractive, without being too sort of advisory council-y, where it's kind of like we'll bring you together when we have ideas and our ideas and solutions to get your feedback on. So it does require some thinking about what does that look like upstream so there is that influence lives across the trajectory rather than just in response to, because a lot of this stuff has been set into motion with, pretty rigid some pretty rigid guidelines and criteria.
I guess that is a
Hmm.
large, some of the projects
No,
like
yeah, I
large
agree.
scoping, right? And then maybe it can be scaled down to a narrower
Hmm.
subdomain, But what my observation is that we have this tagline, but we don't seem to have a momentum or initiative to really to say, let's apply the co-design principle
Yeah.
to this goal. And maybe we'll find out that the goal may be too big or something, that you need to subdivide into sub co-design projects of some nature. That and we sort of lack that particular
Hmm.
realization that now that we're buying into co-design,
Hmm.
how can we use that process, the framework, to apply to solving a real problem
Hmm.
that our community really espouses, that have this aspiration to really to walk the walk, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree.
Thank you anyway. Yeah.
Thank you all. I do see, I believe Amanda has a question in the chat. She says, I'm curious to discuss the experiences of members of marginalized communities who have participated in co-design projects and if they need, or if they noted a discernible difference in the processes or outcomes when compared to traditional methods of community engagement. Have you captured any of that insight, Jess?
Yes, and I can share that individually, but we have I already forgot. June. If you look at the Minnesota Public Health Association website, we'll be doing a webinar, which will include one of our co-designers that will be sharing their experience as part of that work. The project I cited, the LGBTQ plus health care access, and that's also the one that we'll be sharing at the national conference. And again, sort of sharing some of those personal insights and shifts from traditional methods. I would say one of the biggest things is you hear, things like they'll say things like, well, Chow, I think you have an example of when you were a co-designer. Maybe you want to share that.
Yes, Amanda, I actually thought about this when I was reading your question out loud. So many years ago, when I worked at RCTC, I was asked to participate as a co-designer on the Discovery Walk project. And in reflecting, I was asked this question that you've asked, and I was a little choked up by it because I realized it was the first time living in this community that anybody had asked me what kind or type of community I wanted to live in. I had never been asked that question. It was always figure out how you're going to fit into this already created or curated space or place. And it made it difficult during the co-design process sometimes to answer those questions because they had never been asked of me before. But I've had the same reflection from other co-designers, but interestingly also from co-design facilitators. So we train facilitators from communities, and they share that it's the very first time that they have been asked to facilitate these types of conversations within their own communities.
Mhm.
Looking at the time here, wondering if anyone else has questions or reflections. I think, John, I see your hand up.
Thank you very much. Curious about, back to Al's question, maybe, where is that city? Is that a project that we are working on? I know that, if so, who is leading that? The City of Health? I know we hear different pockets talk about it, but is there a leadership, or is that, just to follow up on that, or to close that
Yeah, I
mic,
think it's
where we're at, and are we pursuing it?
yeah, it's the charge of, the Destination Medical Center, dollars, which suggest it's a pretty distributed goal. But I don't know that there's any formal, I mean, it's more of an aspiration, I would say, but I do connect with, and I know Al and I have had this conversation in the past about what might that look like, particularly from the community side. And I know DMC's got the 10-year plan where there is a bit of a increased attention and focus on, that aspect and in particular community, not just the livability for people coming to work here, but the community more broadly. But I'm not aware of like a formal governing structure or anything like that that is monitoring, defining. I think
Or
there's a lot
involving
of
and
activities
engaging a
within
number of
that,
other
but
people
yeah,
would be
yeah.
important because, well, DMC and certainly the city do beautiful work. It's if that is going to be an initiative, it should involve a lot more people,
I agree.
community in the process. And I think maybe to Al's point more broadly, that would be really a cool thing if the city were more broad, not the government, but if the people were more involved in that process as that city, creating that city of health. I haven't
I agree.
pursued that with others, but Al brought it up, so it made me think about it, and I appreciate it. And Jess, good to see you.
Yeah, you too. And just Chow, before we move on, I just again, in that presentation, and Chow, the team will also be sharing that paper I referenced at the top here. So thanks everyone, and thanks for all the work. I know many of you are doing aspects of this, and we're all very fortunate for that.
And thank you, Jess. And I think you've challenged us and myself, I'll say, to think about our work fairly differently. I was quickly jotting down some things that stood out to me in the conversation that we're having today. I mean, one of them was talking about agenda setting authority. You know, how many times in our organizations are we asking community what they would like to discuss or what is important or forefront to them? But I did have a quick question for you, Jess, before we move on. One of your slides said representation without structural power reproduces the original design problem in a politically acceptable form. And it was a mic drop moment for me. Could you provide an example of one that has been true?
I think most engagement ends up that way, isn't it? I mean, we heard from it is the sort of extractive model of we feel good because we engage folks, but we're going to do basically the thing we were going to do anyway. Like I said, that's the validation model. Done well, building civic infrastructure is about exploration together. And so I think that's where that shift, we can make it sound better. We heard from 1,000 people, but we usually hear from the same people that are bringing the same experience of the ability to access, the safety to access. So I think that's the piece that we've protected ourselves because we've done our due diligence, but we don't have to change again that diagram. Think of the diagram. We did everything at the top level. We didn't have to change anything that lived. We didn't have to change the relationships, the way we relate, the power distribution, any of the things that drive those outcomes.
Yeah, and I asked that question because the reason it resonated for me is quite often when we do that, we then develop policies or processes that we embed into our structures and say, this is the way things have to be done. And if folks don't adhere to that, then they are wrong, right? And so it resonated to me to, I think, question ourselves a little bit more when we are developing some of those policies. And then I love that you said, you know, following the lead of lived experience. I'm going to write that down somewhere and continue to remind myself. And then the last one I do want to mention, just to reiterate, was without governance, co-design becomes insight without consequence. And so I feel like we should all have just brought a bunch of mics today for just keep dropping some of these. I will share the slides with everyone. It was very thought-provoking, I think, conversation for me, but I believe the beginning of a conversation and not the end of one. And before we leave today, other than thanking Jess, I would also like to share a couple of things that are coming up in the next week or two. First one is this Saturday. We'll have the Juneteenth celebration that is going to be held at Soldiers Field from noon to about 5 p.m. We're hoping for nice weather. It is a great time to get community together to celebrate Juneteenth. Shortly after that, coming to the table, Amanda, you're here. You guide conversations really well and often on topics that might be contentious, but provide a great avenue for community members to have wonderfully civically engaged conversations so that we can live in a community that is able to do that. And then lastly, wanting to share that on June 19th is the Juneteenth breakfast that is hosted by Andrew Crockett and his team. You do need to purchase tickets for this one, $28.52. So if you have the opportunity, the means, time, and capacity, this is on Eventbrite. You can purchase a ticket and go to that breakfast. It's always a wonderful event. And then a reminder that our next episode is July 8th. Yes, 8th, 2026, and looking forward to that. And again, as always, really appreciate you for being part of these conversations and taking your lunchtime or lunch hour to listen and or engage in this way. I'll be happy to share the slides along with the paper that Jess has published on this topic. And with that, wishing you a very good rest of June, and we will see you in July.